Why did Jesus touch people whom everyone avoided, people considered impure, dangerous, or unworthy of any human contact? Have you ever stopped to think about the weight of that gesture in a time when a simple touch could destroy reputations, break sacred rules, and cause public scandal? Imagine the scene. Silence hangs in the air, eyes fill with disapproval, no one approaches, and then Jesus does exactly what no one would dare to do. He extends his hand, he touches, and, in that instant, even before any visible word or miracle, something profoundly transformative has already happened. Perhaps today touch seems simple, almost automatic, but in the biblical context, especially in Jesus' day, touching someone considered unclean was crossing a dangerous boundary. It was exposing oneself to judgment, to religious and social exclusion. It was challenging traditions that had been followed for generations. That's what makes this gesture so powerful. Jesus didn't just heal, he communicated something much deeper through his silent actions. Have you ever experienced that, realizing that a gesture speaks louder than 1,000 words? Throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus approaching lepers, the sick, the marginalized, people living on the fringes of society and religion. People who were not only wounded in body, but also in soul, dignity, and identity. And repeatedly, Jesus does something scandalous. He touches, not hastily or distantly, but with intention, presence, and compassion. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this touch was not just an act of kindness. It was a powerful spiritual and social message. In that culture, the impure could not mix with the pure. Physical contact meant contamination. Whoever touched someone impure became impure as well. That was the dominant logic. Therefore, when Jesus extended his hand, he was challenging an entire mentality, revealing a kingdom that functioned in a completely different way. A kingdom in which purity is not lost by touching pain, but manifests itself precisely there. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this detail completely changes how we see who Jesus is and what he came to reveal. Notice that many times Jesus could have healed from a distance. A word would have been enough. He had done it before. But at certain moments he chooses touch. He chooses proximity. He chooses to break the silence with a gesture. This leads us to an uncomfortable yet necessary question. If the miracle could happen without contact, why does Jesus insist on touching? What does this gesture reveal about the heart of God? And what does it denounce about the religious and social structures of the time? Perhaps, as you watch this video, this question resonates with you personally. Who are the people today that nobody wants to touch? Who are the modern impure ones, avoided, ignored, silenced? Jesus' attitude is not stuck in the past. It continues to provoke, challenge, and reveal hidden teachings for those willing to see beyond the surface of the biblical text. On this journey, we will delve into the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that many read quickly, but few truly understand. Because sometimes the true teaching lies not in what he said, but in what he did when no one was prepared to see. And that first gesture, the touch that scandalized a generation, is only the beginning of what still needs to be revealed. And perhaps that's exactly why this story doesn't leave us indifferent. Because in some way we've all been, or still are, in the place of someone who was avoided, ignored, or treated as invisible. Perhaps not because of an illness, but because of pain, a past mistake, a difficult phase, a wound that no one sees. And when we think of Jesus approaching without fear, touching without judgment, something stirs within us. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far. Your experience, your reflection, or even your question can help other people who are going through something similar. This space isn't just for listening to a message, but for creating a real, deep conversation, where each comment expands the reach of what we're reflecting on together. When you share what you felt, you transform this video into a meeting point where faith, history, and life intersect. And if this message is already speaking to you in some way, liking the video is a simple yet powerful way to show that this type of content needs to continue to exist. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of reflection that goes beyond words. And if you feel that these silent gestures of Jesus reveal something you had never stopped to observe before, perhaps this is an invitation to walk with us for longer. Subscribing to the channel is not just pressing a button. It's saying that you want to continue exploring these deeper layers of the Bible, These details that go unnoticed but carry transformative teachings. Each new subscriber strengthens this mission of looking at Jesus with more attention, more sensitivity, and less haste. Because what we are beginning to discover here is not just a historical curiosity or a theological detail. It's a different lens through which to view the gospel, faith, and even how we relate to the people around us. And this is only the beginning. There is much more behind this touch, this gesture that seemed simple, but which carried immense spiritual and social weight. And that is exactly what we will delve into now, following step by step what this silent act of Jesus still has to reveal to us. To understand the true weight of Jesus' gesture, it is necessary to take a few steps back and see the world as it was seen at that time. Not with today's eyes, but with the mentality of a society deeply shaped by religious laws, oral traditions, and a constant fear of losing purity before God. When biblical texts speak of unclean people, they are not only referring to visible illnesses or specific physical conditions. Uncleanness was a much broader label, affecting someone's entire identity and determining their place, or lack thereof, within the community. To be considered impure meant living on the margins. Not just far from the temple, but far from people, far from fellowship, far from human touch. Diseases like leprosy, bleeding, certain disabilities, contact with the dead, or even specific everyday situations could turn someone into a social problem. Impurity wasn't just something one had, it was something one was, and this shaped decisions, relationships, and the value a person placed on their own life. Gradually, these people ceased to be seen as individuals and began to be treated as walking hazards. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this detail completely changes how we read the Gospels. Impurity functioned as an invisible, yet extremely powerful barrier. Those considered impure could not fully participate in religious life, could not move freely, and could not be touched. Isolation was both physical and emotional. Imagine waking up every day knowing that your mere presence causes discomfort, fear, or rejection. This continuous experience shaped the mind, affected the mentality, and created an inner journey marked by shame, silence, and loneliness. It's important to understand that, within this logic, avoiding the impure was not seen as cruelty, but as obedience. People believed they were protecting themselves, their families, and their relationship with God. The problem is that, over time, this protection transformed into systematic exclusion. The law, which should have pointed towards life, began to justify profound separations. And behind the scenes of this seemingly correct religiosity, lives were slowly erased. Stories, dreams, and identities remained suspended in a social limbo difficult to break through. It is in this context that the impact of Jesus' actions begins to take shape. Because when he approaches someone considered impure, he is not merely ignoring a rule. He is confronting an entire thought structure. He is challenging a mentality that placed purity above the person. And this was no small detail. It was a true rupture, a revelation that exposed a hidden truth about the human heart, the ease with which we use rules to distance ourselves from the pain of others. Many of these people had given up hope. Prolonged exclusion breeds conformity. When someone is pushed out of human interaction for long enough, they begin to believe that this is their natural place. Faith becomes distant, hope weakens, and life enters survival mode. Therefore, when Jesus approaches, the shock is not only external, it is internal. Something within these people begins to stir even before the healing, even before the visible restoration. The simple fact of being seen, of being considered, already initiates a process of transformation. And perhaps there is a direct connection here with our time. Today, the categories have changed, the labels are different, but the mechanism is very similar. There are still people who carry invisible marks and are distanced by collective decisions, by silent judgments, by glances that avoid contact. Emotional, spiritual, and social exclusion still exists, and often it happens in the name of values considered correct. Understanding who the impure were in Jesus' time forces us to look more honestly at our own attitudes and the criteria we use to approach or distance ourselves from someone. When Jesus touches these people, he is saying something without using words. He is revealing that the kingdom of God does not operate through the logic of fear, but through the logic of restoration. He is showing that true purity is not protected by isolation, but manifests itself when it encounters pain and transforms it. This gesture carries an impact that goes far beyond physical healing. It reconstructs identities, restores belonging, and redefines human value. And all this happens in silence, in the interval between the distancing imposed by society and the unexpected approach of Jesus. This context prepares us to understand why these encounters are so disconcerting. Nothing there is random. Each approach, each touch, each glance carries a profound intention, almost as if Jesus were rewriting the narrative of these people before everyone. And the more we understand who the avoided ones were, the more we perceive the weight of Jesus' decisions to approach them. There is something much bigger happening there, something that continues to echo and demand a more attentive, more honest, more profound reading. If all of this that we're reflecting on starts to resonate with you, comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is something extremely powerful happening in Jesus' silences that many people pass by too quickly to perceive. We live in a culture that values explanations, long speeches, well-structured arguments. But, in the Gospels, Jesus often chooses another path. In many decisive moments, he doesn't begin by speaking. He acts, and this silent action carries a spiritual density that words perhaps could not convey. When Jesus touches someone considered unclean, he is speaking without opening his mouth. The touch becomes language, a language that transcends religious, social, and emotional barriers simultaneously. For those accustomed to hearing only disapproval, silence, or orders to stay away, that simple gesture transformed into a profound revelation. It was as if Jesus were saying, without speaking, "You are seen, you are worthy, you belong." This type of communication doesn't go through reason first, it goes straight to the heart. There is something very human about this. Before any external transformation, we all need to be recognized. We need to feel that our existence matters. Jesus understood this absolutely. That is why, often, he doesn't begin by solving the visible problem. He begins by restoring the invisible dignity. Touch precedes healing because the human being is not just body. It is history, emotion, memory, identity. And Jesus deals with all of this at the same time, in a single silent gesture. This silence is not empty. On the contrary, it is laden with meaning. Behind the scenes of these encounters, something profound is being reconfigured. The mindset of the observer begins to be challenged. The person touched begins to see themselves in a different way. And the very concept of purity begins to shift. Jesus does not speak out against the system at that moment, but exposes its flaws with an attitude impossible to ignore. The impact is inevitable. It's interesting to note that, by touching, Jesus makes himself vulnerable. He approaches what others avoid. He takes the risk of judgment, scandal, and misunderstanding. This reveals much about his decisions. Nothing there is impulsive. Each gesture carries intention, purpose, and a hidden truth being revealed little by little. Jesus seems to teach us that true authority doesn't need to shout to be perceived. It manifests itself firmly, even in silence. When we look at these gestures today, we are invited on an inner journey. Because Jesus' silence compels us to slow down, to observe more attentively, to perceive nuances. He teaches us that not every transformation begins with a clear answer. Sometimes it begins with presence, with closeness, with a gesture that communicates more than any explanation. And this directly impacts how we deal with the people around us. How many times do we try to solve everything with words, quick advice, or judgments disguised as guidance? Jesus follows a different path. He approaches first. He touches first. He creates a safe space before any visible change. This reveals a profound spiritual pedagogy based on empathy and real connection. It's not a cold method. It's an encounter. And true encounters always leave marks. For those touched, that moment became a turning point, not only because something would change physically, but because someone had crossed the distance imposed by society. Someone had broken the oppressive silence with a silence full of meaning. This type of experience redefines how a person sees themselves and how they move forward from then on. The transformation begins from the inside out, even when it is not yet visible to everyone. And for those observing, discomfort is inevitable. Jesus' silence is unsettling, provocative, and exposing. He forces each person to confront their own certainties. Why does that gesture disturb so much? What exactly is being threatened there? Often, it's not the law itself, but the way it has been used to justify exclusion. Jesus doesn't need to explain this. The gesture does that work on its own. That's why these moments remain so relevant. They transcend centuries because they deal with something essential to the human experience. We all carry areas that have been silenced, wounds that have been avoided, parts of our history that we have learned to hide. When we look at Jesus touching without saying anything, we are invited to revisit these areas with more honesty and less fear. There is something liberating in this welcoming silence. And the more we delve into these details, the more we realize that nothing in the Gospels is superficial. Every gesture is a key. Every silence is a door. And, little by little, these revelations connect, forming a larger, deeper, more challenging picture than it appears at first glance. There are still important layers to this movement of Jesus, especially when we understand what happens after the silence has already spoken everything that needed to be said. If this reflection resonated with you in any way, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we touch upon one of the most radical and silent inversions in the entire gospel. Something that doesn't appear in discourse, but reveals itself in practice, in detail, in the gesture that changes everything. In the religious logic of the time, the equation was simple and undeniable. The impure contaminates the pure. That's how people thought, how they taught, how they lived. Contact was seen as a threat, proximity as a risk. Purity needed to be protected at all costs, even if it meant distancing people, silencing stories, and breaking human bonds. But when Jesus enters the scene, this logic begins to unravel before everyone's eyes. He doesn't just ignore this equation, he completely reverses it. By touching the unclean, Jesus doesn't become unclean. It is the unclean who is transformed. And this isn't just a theological detail, it's a profound revelation about how the kingdom of God works, a hidden truth that directly confronts the mindset based on fear, control, and separation. This reversal doesn't happen noisily. There are no announcements, no lengthy explanations. It happens in the encounter. At the moment when everyone expects Jesus to withdraw, he approaches. At the instant when tradition dictates retreat, he advances. And this movement carries an enormous impact because it exposes something that many were not ready to face. Perhaps the problem was never the impurity of people, but the way purity was understood. Purity, in Jesus' view, is not fragile. It is not easily lost. It doesn't need to hide. On the contrary, it is active, transformative, expansive. Where Jesus is, life happens. Where he touches, something is reorganized inside and out. This completely changes how we understand spiritual authority. Jesus doesn't exercise authority by keeping his distance, but by drawing near. He doesn't rule through exclusion, but through restoration. Behind the scenes of these encounters, something even deeper is being revealed. Jesus is showing that the kingdom of God does not operate through the same human structures that we have learned to accept as normal. While human systems build walls to preserve power, the kingdom builds bridges to restore people. While the religion of the time prioritized rules over faces, Jesus restored faces to their lost dignity. This is a transformation that begins in mindset and is reflected in decisions. It's impossible not to notice the contrast. On one hand, a logic that says, "Stay away so you don't get contaminated." On the other, a Jesus who says, without words, "Come closer, because that's how life flows again." This inversion reveals something essential about who he is. His purity doesn't depend on the environment. It redefines the environment. His presence isn't threatened by pain. It transcends it and transforms it. And this challenges us more than we'd like to admit, because, if we're honest, we often still operate according to old logic. We still choose distance as a form of self-protection. We still use spiritual justifications to avoid involvement. We still confuse holiness with isolation. Jesus' example dismantles all of this with disconcerting simplicity. He shows us that true spirituality is not measured by how much we avoid, but by how much we are able to love without fear. This reversal also reveals something about the value of people. If the purity of Jesus is greater than any impurity, then no one is beyond the reach of restoration. No one is irredeemable. No one is disposable. This completely changes the narrative. The journey ceases to be about who deserves it and becomes about who needs it. And, in this kingdom, human need always finds its answer in divine compassion. When Jesus touches, he is saying that light does not flee from darkness. It enters into it, and this image is too powerful to be ignored. It forces us to rethink our own attitudes, our own criteria, our own internal boundaries. The impact of this reversal was not confined to the first century. It continues to echo, confronting choices, revealing inconsistencies, opening space for a more vibrant, more human, more real faith. And the more we observe these gestures, the more we realize that Jesus was not merely healing isolated individuals. He was inaugurating a new way of existing, a new logic of relationship, a new understanding of spiritual life. An understanding where purity is not defended by fleeing, but manifests itself through transformation. Where authority does not oppress, but liberates. Where love does not calculate risks, but transcends boundaries. This revelation sets the stage for something even deeper, because if purity triumphs over impurity, then the effects of this touch go far beyond the individual. They reach the community, the structures, the broken bonds. And it is precisely at this point that the consequences of this gesture begin to spread in ways that few were prepared to perceive. If all of this starts to make sense to you, comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because perhaps here lies one of the most forgotten and most impactful dimensions of Jesus' gestures. When we think of miracles, it's common to focus only on the body that was healed, the illness that disappeared, the pain that ceased. But in the context in which Jesus lived, physical healing was only the surface of something much greater. The true miracle often happened after the touch, when that person returned to exist socially, spiritually, and emotionally. Being healed by Jesus didn't just mean walking again, seeing again, or being cleansed of an illness. It meant being seen again without fear, being able to move around without being pointed at, belonging again. These people weren't just sick, they were alienated from community life. They had been pushed out of common spaces, conversations, celebrations, and family gatherings. Some had lived in isolation for years, not only from the temple but from their own social identity. When Jesus touches someone in these conditions, he is not merely solving an individual problem. He is provoking a collective impact. Jesus' touch happens before witnesses. People observe. Religious authorities react. The entire community is confronted with that scene. Because, from the moment Jesus touches and heals, no one can pretend that that person no longer exists. The miracle compels society to reconsider its decisions, its categories, and its limits. Behind the scenes of these encounters, something profound is being reorganized. Jesus' touch acts as a silent announcement. This person is no longer outside. They can no longer be ignored. They need to be reintegrated. This breaks down old stigmas, dismantles labels, and exposes the fragility of systems that were sustained by exclusion. Social restoration doesn't happen by chance. It is a direct consequence of the way Jesus chooses to act. This detail completely changes our reading of the gospel, because Jesus is not only interested in isolated individuals, but in the way relationships are rebuilt. He knows that prolonged exclusion distorts a person's self-perception and also the mentality of the community they exclude. Therefore, his gestures always carry a greater reach than they seem at first glance. The impact of touch spreads, reaching families, neighbors, leaders, and entire structures. It's impossible not to notice the implicit confrontation. By reintegrating the excluded, Jesus exposes religious systems that had lost their sensitivity. Systems that, in the name of purity, distanced instead of welcoming. Systems that prioritized norms above people. Jesus doesn't make a direct speech against them at that moment. He does something even more powerful. He shows, in practice, a living alternative. A different way of organizing life, relationships, and spirituality. This social restoration also reveals something essential about the kingdom of God. It is not limited to the inner heart, although it begins there. It manifests itself in relationships, structures, and shared spaces. Wherever the kingdom arrives, people are reconnected. Stories are resumed. Interrupted lives begin to flow again. And this happens because Jesus understands that no one was created to live isolated, forgotten, or reduced to their own pain. When we bring this to current reality, the connection becomes inevitable. We live in a world that, despite being hyperconnected, continues to exclude in more subtle ways. People are distanced because of past mistakes, social labels, emotional frailties, choices that don't fit certain patterns. Exclusion may no longer happen at the temple door, but it happens in glances, in silences, in the absence of invitations, in decisions that maintain distance. Jesus' gesture remains profoundly relevant because it compels us to reconsider our own practices. Who are we leaving on the margins? Who has been healed in some area of life but still lacks a place to belong? Who carries a history of exclusion that has never truly been restored? The social restoration that Jesus promotes is not comfortable because it demands real change. It requires openness, humility, and a willingness to rebuild relationships. By touching the community, Jesus assumes the cost of this reintegration. He knows that returning someone to the community is not simple. It involves resistance, criticism, and questioning. But he does not back down. This reveals a spiritual leadership that does not seek approval, but transformation. A leadership that understands that the true impact of the kingdom is not in maintaining the status quo, but in creating new possibilities for coexistence. And there is something even deeper happening here. When Jesus reintegrates someone, he also heals the community. Because a society that learns to welcome becomes more human. A community that learns to see beyond labels becomes more alive. Restoration is not one-sided. It spreads. It educates. It transforms mindsets. It reveals a hidden truth. Everyone loses when someone is excluded, and everyone wins when someone is restored. These gestures of Jesus continue to teach us that faith is not just belief, but practice. It is not just personal experience, but collective responsibility. The kingdom he inaugurates is not a closed space for a few, but a movement that restores people to a full life. And the more we observe these details, the more we realize that Jesus' miracles always point to something greater than the moment itself. There is an even deeper layer to this restoration process, something that happens within the observer, within the one who has been touched, and within the one who decides to respond to this movement. Because after someone is reintegrated, nothing is ever exactly the same again. The community needs to reorganize. Relationships need to be reviewed. Certainties need to be challenged. And it is at this point that the gospel ceases to be just a beautiful message and becomes a real invitation to transformation. If this reflection resonates with you, write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've seen so far serves not only to admire Jesus from a distance, but to place us before a mirror. His silent gestures have always had this disconcerting power. They reveal who he is, but they also expose who we are. When Jesus touches the untouchable, he is not merely solving an old problem. He is posing a question that spans the centuries and reaches us with the same intensity. How do you react to those whom society has learned to avoid? Jesus' actions reveal a heart not guided by convenience, reputation, or comfort. They reveal someone who doesn't judge people by what they represent socially, but by what they carry internally. He sees beyond the outer layers, beyond the labels, beyond the poorly told stories. And this confronts us because following Jesus is not just agreeing with what he said, but allowing his logic to reorganize our mindset, our decisions, and the way we relate to one another. It's easy to admire Jesus in biblical texts. What's difficult is realizing that he continues to speak today, often in the same way, silently through actions that challenge our standards. Who are the impure of today? Perhaps they are not people with visible illnesses, but people marked by mistakes, by failures, by choices that society does not easily forgive. People who are emotionally wounded, people who are tired, people who do not fit into religious or social expectations. People whom we have learned, almost without realizing it, to keep at a distance. The hidden truth is that Jesus' actions continue to call us to a more practical and less comfortable faith. A faith that is not limited to beautiful words or theoretical positions, but that manifests itself in presence, closeness, and compassion. Jesus does not outsource love. He does not delegate care. He gets involved, and this completely redefines what it truly means to follow him. When we observe Jesus touching, welcoming, and reintegrating, we realize that he is not interested in creating impressed followers, but transformed people. The transformation he proposes doesn't just happen internally, but overflows into relationships. It changes the way we look, the way we react, the way we decide who deserves our attention. And often, this transformation begins when we let go of quick judgments and allow ourselves to see people as ongoing stories, not as closed cases. Jesus' gestures also reveal courage. Courage to approach when everyone else moves away. Courage to touch when everyone else retreats. Courage to love when it comes at a cost. This courage doesn't stem from impulse, but from a deep conviction about human value. Jesus doesn't love out of naivete. He loves because he knows who he is and what he carries. His identity is so firm that no external impurity can threaten it. And this teaches us something essential. The more secure our identity is, the less fear we have of approaching the pain of others. Bringing this teaching into the present, we are invited on an honest journey. Not to blame ourselves, but to awaken. In what moments do we choose the silence that pushes away, instead of the silence that welcomes? In what situations do we prefer to preserve our image, instead of restoring someone else? These questions don't have quick answers, but they are necessary. They reveal whether our faith is more aligned with human structures or with the heart of Jesus. Following Jesus, in light of these gestures, means accepting that spirituality is not a refuge to escape human complexity, but an invitation to enter into it with greater sensitivity. It means understanding that the gospel does not distance us from difficult people. It brings us closer to them. And this is not weakness. It is strength. It is spiritual maturity. It is real impact. Perhaps the greatest lesson from these silent gestures is this. Jesus didn't wait for people to be ready to be touched. He touched them so that they could finally get up. This changes everything. It changes how we see grace, restoration, and the very purpose of faith. The journey with Jesus doesn't begin when everything is resolved. It begins with the encounter, the gesture, the decision to draw near. And when we realize this, something within us begins to stir. Because we understand that these gestures are not stuck in the past. They continue to resonate, calling us to a faith that acts, that feels, that gets involved. A faith that is not content to observe from a distance, but that is willing to live this inverted logic of the kingdom, even when this requires profound adjustments in our way of life. If this reflection resonates with you, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation truly touched you. And that, in itself, says a lot. This channel exists precisely for this kind of deeper reflection, to calmly examine the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that continue to speak to us today. So, if this content has helped you see the gospel from a different angle, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue walking together, exploring these layers that often go unnoticed but make all the difference in our journey. If you'd like, leave a comment below to let me know you stayed until the end. You could write something like, "This message was for me." This helps create a sense of community and also shows me that this type of content is really worth continuing to produce. And if, throughout the video, you felt that connection, that moment of reflection, liking the video is just a silent way of saying, "This made sense to me." Sometimes, a simple gesture also carries a lot of meaning. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into the details about Jesus that almost no one notices. Click on it and continue reading.